Today is February 22nd, 2017. I'm Adrienne Falaise, and it is my honor to be interviewing Dr. Horace Newcomb for the Archive of American Television, and we're here at his home in Austin, Texas. Okay, thanks so much for sitting down with us today, Horace.
Oh, it's my pleasure, as they say in the hotel.
So we'd just like to start right at the beginning and get some background information. So what was your name at birth?
Horace McClellan Newcomb, Jr.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Jackson, Mississippi on August 22nd, 1942.
Did you grow up there as well?
Mostly, we lived there after my dad came home from the war. We moved for a few years to North Mississippi, a small town called Sardis, Mississippi. Then when I was 12 years old, we moved back to Jackson, and that's where I lived for the duration.
What were your parents' names and what did they do for a living?
My dad's name was Horace McClellan Newcomb, Sr. A number of things. He was born here in Texas, not very far from here. His dad died when he was about 16, and my dad helped his mother on a farm and went to one semester of college. After that, he got various jobs and worked for a while at what was called a Toddle House, which was a fast food restaurant in Houston. They transferred him to Jackson, Mississippi. He worked at the Toddle House there until, as the story goes, he was fired for giving away the chocolate cream pie recipe. And then he worked as a short order cook in some places, met my mother, who was a registered nurse. The nurses came in off the night shifts and they began to flirt and married in 1939. After I was born, my mother didn't work as a nurse. My dad was drafted while she was pregnant for World War II, and they delayed his induction until 1944. He was captured in the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 and liberated in April when the Allied forces came through Germany. After the war, we moved to that small town in North Mississippi because he bought a small restaurant of his own. And that's what he would have enjoyed doing until the restaurant didn't make money anymore. And we moved back to Jackson, and he was a postman for the rest of his career. My mother did go back to work as a nurse in her 50s, I think, late 50s, and insisted on wearing the white starched uniform and the nurse's cap, unlike what other nurses were wearing by that time. And he died in 1987, and my mother 10 years later.
And what was your mother's name?
Bernice Adams Newcomb.
Do you have any siblings?
I have one sister who is 6 years younger than me.
What traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
It was a very religious family, so there was a kind of ethical and religious background for all of that. Rather fundamentalist, which I have struggled my way out of for most of my adult life. I think mainly the value of doing what you're supposed to do in your work. You take a job and you do what that requires, and I think that certainly was very important in my academic career.
What were some of your interests when you were little?
Actually, pretty generally popular culture. I had lots of comic books. My parents didn't mind that. Comic books cost 10 cents, and if you had a dime to spend, that's what you usually used it for. Radio, we listened to radio, and that probably was the beginning of my media interest because we listened largely to dramatic radio. We listened, my mother would call me if I were out playing and say, "Your stories are on." And I would go in and listen to Bobby Benson and the B-Bar-B Riders and the Lone Ranger and Hopalong Cassidy, Straight Arrow. And then later in the evening, we would listen to Mr. Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons, Mr. Chameleon, Gunsmoke, Tarzan. At one time, we were listening to Gunsmoke on the radio after it had come on television, and we would do both.
Do you remember the first time you saw television?
I think I do. I've written about this. it might be the second time. The first time might have been at a friend's house. My friend's father was an Anglophile. He had spent most of the war in Britain, and he loved British things. He was the only person I knew in this small town who drank hot tea. And he bought a small television set so that he could watch the coronation film. I believe it was a small round screen TV. But the one I remember most is a prize fight. I believe it was the Joe Louis, Ezzard Charles heavyweight fight, which would have, I've checked it and I can't remember the exact date. I could go back and find it. But there was a hardware store in Sardis, Mississippi that sold television sets by this time. It must have been the 1950 or something like that. And I went with my dad. And it was a room, sort of a showroom that had been rearranged with some chairs and boxes and so on, and a television set in the middle. And it was a group of men and boys in this North Mississippi town watching two black men fight to a championship. It was an interesting experience, which I recalled many, many times after that. And I think that was probably the first time.
So what were your first impressions of the medium?
I was intrigued. The cafe that my dad owned was 2 doors down. There was one main street in this town, and the cafe was 2 doors away from the movie theater. I went to the movies every Saturday afternoon, as did every kid in town. These were 3-4 year reruns. It was a long time before I realized that the Frankenstein we were seeing was not made that year. It was the same old Frankenstein. So I loved the movies. I went a lot. We were seeing, we would go in on a Saturday afternoon, and you would have 2 features, a short, a cartoon, and a serial. So you could spend about 3.5 hours there. The features were not that long. It cost 10 cents as well on Saturday afternoon until you were 12 years old, and then it cost $0.25. And on the time I went after my birthday, the woman who owned the theater said, "I'll let you in free to celebrate your birthday." And after that, it was $0.25. And you had a little extra money for popcorn or something like that. But so I was fascinated by those things. I can remember trying to figure out camera movements as the camera moved past what would have been a wall, and we would be in another room, and what happened there? So a lot of that was really the core of what I was thinking about. I really enjoyed that. When we moved back to Jackson, Mississippi, we lived in a suburb, a new 1950s type suburb. And I didn't go to the movies as much, but by that time we had television set in the house, and so I watched television there. After the restaurant the cafe began to fail, my dad worked with a next door in a radio and TV repair shop. He was fascinated by the technical aspects of radio and television, and had done correspondence courses and had learned how to repair. And he was distressed when vacuum tubes began to go away and what he then called printed circuits were used, the very earliest little transistor type things, because they were harder to work on. But even after we moved back to Jackson and he was in the post office, after a couple of years he took a part-time position in a repair shop there and would work in the afternoons after his mail delivery was done. But we watch television most evenings, whatever homework I had to do, which was fairly minimal. I would watch TV. They never restricted anything. There wasn't much to restrict at that point, and so we watched the usual fare. So it really became a large part of my life, even with my friends later.
What were some of your favorite programs growing up?
Well, in the earlier period, the Westerns, certainly Gunsmoke, Have Gun Will Travel, Rawhide, those were the shows, and the mysteries as well, although I remember the Westerns more than the mysteries, and this was a period when the Westerns were dominating the schedule. I did not like sitcoms. I still am not a huge fan of Half Hour, although there's some interesting stuff on now. And I would actually leave the room sometimes in Lucy because I would be embarrassed because I knew exactly what was going to happen. And I've talked to other people who had the same experience. There was something uncomfortable about knowing that they were going to do the same bit over and over again, and you were going to see it. So I would get up and go read or something like that during the half hours. If church was over early on Sunday night, we would watch Ed Sullivan, of course, or catch the second part of it, and that was a really interesting experience as well with television. By the time I got into high school and college years, my friends and I were watching Route 66. Ernie Kovacs was a big influence on us. The Defenders, for me, was a major part of my television experience, watching those social justice things. Peter Gunn, because of the style. We had our own little version of Hypnus. We would go into the instrument room in the band room, and we had a blue light we would put in, and somebody would tap a cymbal, and we would read our poems and things like that. It's pretty remarkable. But this was in a town just outside of Jackson, Mississippi, because we lived outside the city limits. This was Clinton, Mississippi, where I finished high school. A remarkable group of people there. One of my classmates, Barry Hannah, became one of America's best novelists, actually more revered among other novelists than critics. Another friend went on to be the major head of the Southern Baptist Foreign Mission Board, international guy. Another friend went to Annapolis, flew over Vietnam, and is now a retiring major attorney in Los Angeles, who has nothing to do with the media industries, by the way. A number of people have remarked on that group that we called the group, and experienced that. And TV was always sort of in the background. For our talent shows, three of my friends did a takeoff on Ernie Kovacs' Nairobi Trio, and so there was a lot of discussion, a lot of parody. We had a tape recorder in the band room as well, and we would do obscene parodies of the Howdy Doody show. And the principal came one day when nobody was around and took the tape recorder back to his office and began to play some of this. And the next morning we hear the bing, bing, bing on the chimes as he came over the intercom and said, I've heard some stuff, and I know who these boys are, and I know their parents, and I'm going to talk to them if they do anything like this again. I don't think he really knew who we were, but he did threaten that. So we did more after that. So.
So at that point, did you have any inkling of what you wanted to do or be when you grew up?
Oh, like most of those same guys, I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to write fiction and poetry, and that was just sort of a given for some of us. And we were all. I was not a good musician. I was a very good tuba player, but I could never improvise. I had no musical theory capability. But a number of my friends were terrific musicians, and would form little jazz groups and things like that. But it was always that was always in addition to the literature, to reading and writing a lot of poetry, short stories, and so on. And that was always in the back of my mind.
So where did you go to college, and what did you study?
I went from the high school in Clinton, Mississippi, a few blocks away to the college there in Clinton, Mississippi, Mississippi College, which is a Southern Baptist affiliated school. Actually, all of us went there for a while. My friend who went on to Annapolis went 1 year there and then went to Annapolis. One of my friends, one of the more creative guys in the group, skipped college, joined the Navy, came back, went for a couple of years and then didn't finish. But it was a small liberal arts college. It's somewhat larger now. They have a nursing school and some other things. And there too, we were sort of the fringe group. Just to be specific about it, by the time we were juniors and seniors in high school, we were drinking a lot of beer. And that was what we did not want our parents to know, and certainly the people at church and certainly the people at college. I lived at home when I went to Mississippi College for financial reasons, and would, for the most part, hitchhike the 4 miles or 5 miles over to the college and spend the day there, and then hitchhike home. But we had some really good literature teachers, and they were, I suppose for want of a better term, we would call them more liberal than most of the people on the faculty. The college after that became much more conservative in terms of its religious views and so on. But we studied with people who had PhDs from North Carolina and places like that, the really good literature schools. And they were very supportive. I mean, they continued to support our creative efforts, and one really major creative writing teacher, a man called Edgar Simmons, who was a poet, a very good poet, published. He knew a lot of poets. We went to the Mississippi I think it was called the Mississippi Literature Festival. John Crow Ransom was the guest speaker that year. We met Mr. Ransom, one of the great poets of the mid-20th century. So we had all those kinds of opportunities, and at the same time we were still, I suppose, dissenting, rebelling, whatever. I became somewhat more political than some of my friends, not because they didn't share the same values, they just weren't that interested in the politics of it. By the time I graduated from high school, it was very clear to me that the racial situation was untenable in Mississippi and throughout the South and throughout the country. And I was fairly open about that with some people and argued about it with people. Television was a huge part of that, and I can elaborate on that at some point.
Please.
Well, the reason I was hesitant to elaborate on it now is because I didn't realize it for a number of years, how significant it had been. It was probably after I began to write and teach about television. And I tell people now, and I've written this in several different ways, in different little autobiographical essays, that one reason I attended so much to television in my career was because it changed my life. I'm convinced that watching shows like The Defenders, which was week after week treating social justice issues, awakened a consciousness in me about the situation in which I lived. The other example I use is watching Matt Dillon defend the Chinese laundryman from being lynched and thinking, that's everywhere around me, even to the point of lynching. And so I broke with some friends, not many. I kept most of this from my parents for quite some time. But it was clear, and so in that way I think television was crucial not only for my development, but for the development of the society and the culture. We tend to disparage 50s and 60s television and say it's not, the real, well, first of all, we talk about the golden age, the live television dramas, and those played a major part because that's where I saw those camera movements on the live things, and I was wondering, and of course later when I realized what those huge dinosaur-like cameras moving with huge cables and moving around the studio, what that must have taken. But the Chayefsky and the Rose and those kinds of things, the Serling pieces that I watched were certainly instrumental in this same consciousness-raising process. But series television, primetime television, had a lot of stuff in it that people forget about. Some of my students have written about those shows, and I think have done really good work on that period. But during college, you know, that's the other thing. Some of that was diminished because my usual line when I lecture about this is, people complain about watching too much television. Well, you start watching television when you're 3 or 4 years old, and I'm talking mainly about classic network television now, up through the mid-90s. You start watching television when you're a kid, and you watch the cartoons, and then you watch with your parents, and television viewing continues to climb until you're in adolescence. And adolescence has its own pleasures, so you stop watching television. Then you finish adolescence, you go to college, you get a job, you may get married, these kinds of things. And then you start watching television again, and it continues to go up until you die. So, you know, it's this little pattern like this. But during the college years, I did not watch nearly as much television, partly because I worked at night. I fell into a job with the Allstate Insurance Company. I was called one of two. I was the can't find boy, which meant that I would go into work at 4:30 in the afternoon, and there would be a stack of files. And the files had come, there would be a stack of paper. And the paper would have come in, but the files would not in the file cabinet. They were on someone's desk. And so I and another person would move around the entire large 100-desk area there. And when we would find a piece of paper that goes in this file, we find the file on the desk, we put it in there. So I would work from 4 till 8, 9, sometimes 10 o'clock at night. And so I didn't watch much television at that point. After my junior year, my third year in college, Sarah and I were married. Sarah Mitchell Newcomb, who is a huge part of this story. She had graduated, and so she was teaching high school. And I was still finishing my senior year, writing an honors thesis and so on. And just before Christmas, my dad came walking up to our apartment in Clinton, Mississippi, and he had a box in his hand. It was a television set. We didn't have a TV at that point. He said, "Sarah's parents wanted you to have this TV set so you could watch the Christmas shows." And so from then on, we've always had a television set. And then when she was teaching, I would watch some TV while she was grading papers and so on. And then we went off to Chicago for graduate school, and for my graduate school, and continued to watch. But that period during college was important for other reasons, because it was the television consciousness that had come up. And of course, this is 1963. We were married in 1963. We had started going together in 1962. The civil rights movement was in full churn at that point. Even before that, I remember being at my parents' home, and I believe this was before I graduated from high school, maybe my senior year, and the Freedom Riders had come through Jackson and had done a sit-in at a Woolworth's counter and been beaten up and reviled. And my parents obviously knew enough of my feelings at that point. They said, "You don't get involved with anything like this." And they said, "Did you see about that?" I said, "Yes." And they said, this was over nearby. And being the kind of somewhat arrogant, very arrogant young person I was at that point, I said, "Yes, and I'm sure it was a bunch of good Christian people who beat them up." That did not go down very well. It was symptomatic of a kind of tension about that. But I keep going back to those things because I think television was so crucial in what happened for me. And many years later, I was at a meeting and in a late night conversation in a hotel room with a bunch of people and recounting that kind of story. And great television scholar, sociologist, political activist Todd Gitlin said, well, if that's what television did, why didn't everybody in Mississippi turn out like you? And I didn't have a terrific answer, but it was because other people didn't have the same sensibilities, weren't listening to the same kinds of things in church and trying to make them work outside of church. And so it was a crucial time, because the next year, in my senior year, and Sarah was teaching high school, a professor at the college kind of began to walk beside me as I crossed the campus. I've written about this too. And said, some of us know your views, and if you would like to meet some students at Tougaloo College, which is the historically black college on the other side of Jackson, you can go over this Wednesday night and meet at the chaplain's house. They're planning some things. And so we did. Sarah had to go to a PTA meeting before that, and we were dressed up in suit and tie, and she had on a teacher's dress and everything. And so we went to Tougaloo, which was a very scary kind of thing. We'd never been there. We'd never been on a black campus. And we went to the home of Ed King, the Methodist minister who was the chaplain there. He had been beaten up that day and had a big patch on his face. And in the back room of his house, he just showed us where to go. There were students, black and white. Some of the students had come down from Oberlin for Freedom Summer, planning Freedom Summer. Black activists were there. We were the only people from our college. There were some students from Millsaps College, which was a Methodist college in Jackson, which was known as much more liberal and active. And so we met several times and planned a concert, and Joan Baez came in the spring of '64 and sang at Tougaloo. And it was a truly wonderful moment. We had students from black and white colleges all over. And there again, you know, how much of that can I attribute to television? How much of it, you know, was watching what's going on the news by that time, seeing the freedom rides, seeing the arguments, seeing the horrible stuff in Alabama. Combination of news, fiction, what I think of as progressive fiction, but deeply embedded in things like westerns and the lawyer shows, all sorts of things like that. To me, it's why I call it, you know, it is the cultural center of, and it certainly was for a great many years, the social and cultural center of the country. And people saw the same things and had to react to and understand the same things. And there's a richness there that I decided later, for other reasons, I wanted to study.
Well, so tell us about how you got into studying it then.
I was fortunate. I was not a terribly great student, but I was interested in literature and the other arts. And so in my senior year, when I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, and most of the people I knew were going to programs to study English. But we had one teacher who had come through. He was only there for a year or two, who taught a course just in the humanities, where he brought in art history, literature, music, other kinds of things. And so I started poking around, trying to find a program that would combine those things. There weren't very many. There was one at Stanford, I think, which was an MA program. I was applying to graduate school and English departments as well, but I found a program at the University of Chicago called General Studies in the Humanities. And I wrote to the dean of the Humanities Division there. And I had written similar letters to the English departments. And, again, the arrogance of my age at that point. The letter, I think, general beginning and had a line in it that says, "I no longer feel that the South is a healthy place for scholarship." You know, which was just so awful thing to say. I mean, in large part true for some things, but in other ways just sheer outrageous arrogance. At any rate, the Dean of the Humanities Division sent it to the director of the General Studies program, who was Norman MacLean, the great author of A River Runs Through It. Mr. MacLean wrote back and said, your story is really interesting, I understand. He said, I'm from Montana, I know what it's like to want to go somewhere else. Unfortunately, your grades are not good enough for me to give you an entering fellowship. So, okay, I waited. Had some other applications out. In the meantime, the college nominated me for a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. At that time, the Wilson Foundation was giving about 1,000, 1,100 fellowships a year for people to go into college teaching. And I had to go, let's see, I had to make an application. I was asked to come for an interview. I had to get on a train in Jackson and go to Memphis, 200 miles away, for the interview. That's where they did the regional interviews. Did the interview, interesting conversation with some people, probably showing off a little bit again, and I got the fellowship. The fellowship would pay your tuition and give you a $2,000 stipend wherever you were admitted. Actually, in the year that I received it, if you were married, they reduced it to $1,800. They assumed your wife would be working, which was true in our case. Next year it went back up for I don't know. So I got the fellowship, and sometime in the spring I get this handwritten note from Norman MacLean saying, been in the hospital this winter, I just got out, saw your name on the Wilson list, did me more good than the docs, come on to Chicago if you want to, you have friends here. So I don't really know if I was ever formally admitted, I'm not sure. I got there, the stipend was there, so I guess I did. But that was another life-changing moment to go to the University of Chicago. I did the master's in general studies and humanities, took some art history courses, took art history with Joshua Taylor, a great art historian, took a history course with John Hope Franklin, the great black historian of the South. I took a course with John Cowelty on late 19th century American cultural history, which becomes important in a moment. Did the MA, and took what was the equivalent of an entrance exam into the PhD program in the English department. It was called the MA exam, which all MA students had to take in English, and I took it as well, and was admitted to the PhD program in English. This was fall of 1965, and did the PhD in English. During that time, Sarah worked at the university for a while, then she taught high school in the suburbs, and we had a television set, and we would watch television in the evenings, just whatever we wanted to. If she had time to watch, she was preparing and doing other kinds of things, grading. I had work to do, paper writing and that kind of thing, but we usually made time to watch an hour or so of television. And I began to think about it in terms of storytelling and how it told its stories. And then I finished my coursework and got my first job. I finished coursework in 67, wrote the dissertation 67, 68. And I think it was the spring of 1968, John Cowelty taught a course in popular culture, literature and popular culture. The first such course I know of in a major university. There were other places teaching it. And John told the story that he proposed this course to the chair of the English department, a man named Gwen Kolb, who was also from Jackson, Mississippi, and had gone to Millsaps College, who kept his southern accent. Most of mine is gone. And he said, "Can I teach this course?" And Gwen said, "John, can you at least call it literature and popular culture?" And so he did. And it was an undergraduate course, and there were several of us interested in popular culture by this time, and we sat in on that course for several sessions. I don't think I even sat in for the whole course because I was trying to write a dissertation, and which had nothing to do with television. And I realized that there was this sort of growing academic focus on the study of popular materials, largely popular literature, but also film. And film studies was already beginning to be well established in the mid-60s, even in the early 60s in some places. But I did that. My dissertation was on late 19th century American novels. I wrote about Stephen Crane, Frank Norris, and Theodore Dreiser, the heavy-handed naturalist people that most literary scholars sort of don't even teach because they. I make a joke which is not exactly true, although part of it is. I say I wrote on late 19th century American fiction so I could leave out Henry James. I say I love Henry James' sentences. I don't give a whit for his people. I just don't care about those people. I care about the people that Dreiser is seeing as ground down by the world, and the way that Frank Norris puts McTeague out in the desert and he dies, and Stephen Crane with Maggie, a girl of the streets, and those are the writers and the people that I care about. So I did that. I took my first teaching position beginning in the fall of 1968. I hadn't quite finished the dissertation, so I finished it that fall, and the degree came the next year, so the PhD is listed as 69. And I began teaching in an English department at a small liberal arts college in eastern Iowa, Cornell College, a fine college, a group of colleges called the Associated Colleges of the Midwest. Cornell, Grinnell, Coe, Monmouth, St. Olaf, all really good schools. Lots of students from the Chicago suburbs, St. Louis suburbs, for mostly middle class, upper middle class kids, well trained. The college had about 1,000 students, 100 faculty. The town was 2,000 people. We thought, okay, Mr. Chips, let's go be, and that sort of worked out a little bit. But I had begun to be very interested in what was called at the time experimental education. Students and faculty living together, doing all sorts of different kinds of things, and was a little dissatisfied there and was looking around for other places to go. In the must have been in the fall of '69. I saw there was a call for papers for the Midwest Modern Language Association. The MLA is the big literary association, which has huge conventions every year, and there are regional ones in the Midwest MLA. And John Coelty was was proposing a panel on literature and the other arts. And so I had by that time begun to develop a pretty clear idea that I wanted to write about television and not write about literature. And I wanted to write about television as a storytelling medium, based in the humanities, not in the social sciences. There was a lot of stuff written about television by this time. And the social psychologist, of course, had begun all the studies on children and television, politics and television, all of the things that television did to harm the culture in many ways. Very little about how television tells stories and what those stories are about. And so I proposed I proposed a paper on soap opera. Sarah and I had watched soap operas off and on for a long time, and we had stayed in touch with one of them, Another World. And so I wrote this paper. Actually, the first, no, I got this wrong. The first paper I proposed was called The Problem of Repetition in Television. And it was about the formulaic storytelling problems that you have, that I was alluding to before. You see what, if you watched enough, you know what's going to happen. And toward the end of that paper, which I sent to Coelty, I talked about soap opera as having a different narrative structure because it doesn't end, and which changes the narrative probabilities, which allows you to do things you can't do in episodic television where you have to solve the crime, run away the bad guy in the Western, do all of this stuff. And so, and he really wrote back and he said, I'm going to send you something where I've been thinking about repetition. I take a different attitude toward it. But I'm intrigued by this comment about soap opera. Why don't you develop something around that? So I did, and the paper became something I think called Reflections on the Structure of Soap Opera. What he sent me was the typescript, the manuscript of The Six Gun Mystique, which is his first major book on popular culture. And it talks about formula and how the formulas embody deep cultural concerns, structures, values, attitudes, so that the Western may seem the same all the time, but it's really not. It's dealing with different problems. It's dealing with savagery and civilization. It's dealing with gender roles. It's dealing with all sorts of things. And so I did the paper on soap opera and presented it. It was well received. People had not even thought about television much before. Film studies people really sort of sneered at television, even though there were some film programs in universities, and some still do. And so I did that paper, and I began to say, okay, there's something I want to do here. And I was by this time teaching at Saginaw Valley College in Saginaw, Michigan, trying to build a humanities program from the ground up with all sorts of different things in it. Largely, I was appointed in an English department, but was teaching with another colleague and doing collaborative and interdisciplinary work. And I wanted to find out what had been written about television from the humanities point of view. So I would go down to Ann Arbor on the weekends, we had friends there, and go to the Michigan Library and start looking up television stuff. And I would find some articles. I found a few books that had been, there was a book called, I can't remember the title of the book, but it was done for the National Council of Teachers of English, and it was about stories in television and how people use them. And I gathered as many articles and essays as I could find, and wrote up a proposal for an anthology, a collection of articles about television from the humanities perspective. And I wrote a prospectus, or just a query letter more accurately, and sent it to various publishers, just cold, and got very little response, except from Doubleday. And the editor that it went to there, an acquisitions editor named Robert Whitehead, wrote back and said, we don't do well with anthologies. Why don't you write a monograph about television? Write me a proposal and we'll see how it goes. And so I did. I wrote up a proposal, and this forced me to figure out what I wanted to do with it. And so I wrote a proposal structured around the story types, what we would call genres, but what Coelty had referred to as formulas and what I referred to as formulas. But there were chapters on the situation comedy, chapters on family comedy, chapters on mysteries, on doctors and lawyers, on westerns. And Whitehead liked it, sent me a contract, actually for an academic, a strange thing, gave me an advance. And it was published as TV, the Most Popular Art, in the Doubleday Anchor paperback original series. A fine series of books. And at that time, some major works.
I do want to ask a little bit about your research process for that book, though, because there were no home VCRs for repeat viewings of shows or anything at that time. So what was your process for studying shows?
Well, for TV, the Most Popular Art, which I just called the Most Popular Art, once we had the contract in place, and so I was thinking about two things. I was thinking about how to describe, I'll call them the genres, how to describe them, analyze the structures of them, and also what they had to say about American culture. And I wrote from memory. And I tell people, some of these things might be incorrect. They're my memories of episodes, because I had to describe some episodes and talk about them in these shows, in these chapters. And so, but I still recall episodes of Gunsmoke. I still recall episodes of other things. And I should say, by the way, that while I was in graduate school and Sarah and I were watching television, one of the shows we watched was the original Star Trek, which obviously, by design, was dealing with major cultural and social issues. And so that was another sort of provocation about writing about TV. So Star Trek, and then later, when we were in Iowa watching TV, by this time with a baby in the house, and the baby would go to bed and we would watch some TV. Sometimes the baby would go to bed and we would watch TV. What I think of as silly shows like Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and Land of the Giants, these very odd little science fiction shows. And they were all about these people in places that they had to deal with other cultures and other societies. They were knockoffs of Star Trek, obviously. They were voyage shows. They were going places where nobody had gone before, like the bottom of the sea. So we were watching those, but when it came time to write about them, for the most part, I could recall some of those things. I didn't even go back to look at TV Guide for log lines or synopses or things like that. And usually in each chapter there are no more than one or two descriptions of episodes, but then there's the description of the formula, the genre, and how the genre structures these issues that have to be dealt with. So I describe the Most Popular Art as something of a backbroken book. It's half focused on what later I called in the last chapter aesthetics, the narrative structures and so on, and half on the cultural analysis. What are these shows saying about American culture, and how are we dealing with issues and problems and provocations? And I could do that because I recalled so much, and I also, by that time, realized that I just knew a heck of a lot about television. There were only 3 networks. I had watched a great deal of it. I could recall it. I could compare it with other kinds of program. I could compare across networks, across different instances. In the introduction, I made a major point of saying, this is not social science. This is not, this is what the social scientists do. It was a rather cursory explanation of what they did. This is not economics. I'm not writing about the industry. I'm writing about the program content. And essentially, nobody had done that in this country. Raymond Williams was doing it in Britain. And his book, Television Technology and Cultural Form, came out about the same year. And it was, that was a major thing. And then there are all sorts of other academic versions of ferment going on, leading to what later became cultural studies and approaches to popular culture and so on. But the most popular art was pretty significant in being the first book that treated American television that way. And it was recognized pretty quickly, not by critics, but by academics. It was taught in English departments, it was taught in drama departments, and it was even taught in some film studies programs. My great colleague here, Tom Schatz, author of The Genius of the System, one of the best books on film history ever written on the studio era, tells the story of being in graduate school at the University of Iowa, which had one of the major film programs by this time with Dudley Andrew and others there. And one of his graduate student colleagues, Bobby Allen, Robert C. Allen, who writes about television, came through Tom's office one day and tossed a copy of the most popular art on his desk and said, "Have you seen this? You've got to read this." And you know, people who came out of that program who later went on to do television, Jane Fuhr, other people, got a taste of television at that point in a film school. And I think Bobby actually used it in a class. I'm not sure about that, but so it was taken up pretty quickly, and is still cited with some regularity, I'm pleased to say. Stayed in print for 10 years, from 74 to 85.
I do want to talk about a section of the book where you address the new shows,
yeah.
kind of these shows of the late 60s and 70s that don't fit so easily into
Right,
those
yeah.
genres. So I wanted to just name a few of them, and if you could just comment on how they kind of stood apart at the time.
Well, there's another little part here. I left Saginaw to go to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and I was appointed there in an American Studies program. And I was brought there to teach popular culture. So I taught popular fiction, taught some film, usually in a course. I would do a genre course. I would do the Western, and I would do a movie, a novel, TV shows, and so on. Soon after I got there, in the first year that we were there, I had the book contract. It wasn't finished, the most popular art. And I decided I wanted to talk to some TV people, so I went out to the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting to interview the program director there. And as we were talking, he said, you know, the television critic for the Baltimore Morning Sun is leaving. You know, I had shown him some things I had written. He said, why don't you go down to the paper and talk to them? So I called the Sun and spoke with the features editor, and he said, come in and talk. Turned out Charlie Flowers was from Tennessee, and so we hit it off as all expatriate Southerners do. And he said, okay, write me a review of a television show. And I wrote, I think the first review I wrote was The Waltons. And this would have been in 1973. 72 to 3 to 4. I get these kind of the overlapping things. And he said, okay, I like this, write me another one. I did. He said, okay, you can have the job. We need 600 words a day, 5 days a week, $35 a column. And so here are the circumstances. There were no real previews. There were occasional line feeds from the networks, and you had to go to the local network to see a preview of a show if you wanted to do that. Well, I was teaching full-time, 3 courses a semester, and finishing the book. Had 2 children by this time. Again, you know, none of this would happen without my home. And so what I had to do was watch and there was a 10:30 deadline. So, and I'm on the East Coast. So I had to watch a television show, write my 600 words, get in my car, drive it down to the newspaper, and hand it to the copy editor. Never missed a deadline. And I told Charlie after a couple of weeks, I said, look, I'm going to have to write about shows that appeared 2 days earlier. I'm going to have to be writing, this will not be a preview kind of column. It won't be it'll be writing about television. And so he said, sure, that's fine, just fill the space, which I did, which led to all sorts of things. During the Watergate hearings, I was writing about the hearings. I was reviewing the Watergate hearings as performance in many ways. So I was doing all that, and then these shows began to appear. All in the Family had already started, and Mary Tyler Moore had already started. I listed the Waltons there because it was just a different tonality. It didn't have the same kind of episodic feel that required a wrap-up. Now, they did always have a plot that was wrapped up, but the story was the family. And All in the Family was treating social issues. Mary Tyler Moore, as we've heard just recently on Ms. Moore's death, was dealing with all sorts of issues in a different way, a gentler kind of way, but in some ways more sophisticated even than All in the Family, which was right there, and Mr. Lear knew exactly what he was doing. And there was, my sense was that television was changing, that it was coming of age in a way that had not, despite all the wonderful things I say about 50s and 60s television, there was a sameness about it. Shows like The Young Lawyers or The Storefront Lawyers would come on and treat social issues for a while, and if they didn't get the ratings, they were gone. And there was very little experimentation. We know all of the usual stock phrases, lowest common denominator, all of this kind of thing, and the industry worked that way. And later, when I began to talk to television professionals, there was the sense that television, even perhaps mainly in the industry, was a second-tier profession. A lot of people, and Mr. Lear's talked about this, he wanted to make movies, but then he began to see how television operated, and he did create some movies. But a lot of people always thought of television as a stepping stone to film production. And I think it was in this period that things began to change somewhat. There were certainly people who were producing it and loved it and knew what they were doing and could see very clearly. Obviously, Roddenberry knew what he was doing with Star Trek. Lincoln Levinson knew what they were doing with their social problem plays. And this was a period of the made-for-television movie doing some really wonderful things. But those shows that broke away from the formula, I think, did a number of things. They woke up an audience, and I don't believe the audience was asleep in a negative way before that, but it just made more options out there. But I also think it awakened some people in the industry to say we can crack away from some of these things that we've been doing. Maybe the best way to put it is to say we can take some chances, because I think it was a very safe industry. With 3 networks, with the ratings as high as they could be, to get a 20 share or something like that. And the advertisers were happy. And so the money was rolling in. The fence-in rules made it, if you had a hit, you're going to make money for the rest of your life. You were just going to keep raking in the money. And so I think it was a period of complacency that suddenly began to maybe blossom is the best metaphor, to say we can do these other things, which leads to people like the MTM group saying, we can do other kinds of things here. And you get a supportive administration like Mr. Tinker saying, I hire talent. I look for talent and I let them do what they can do best. And then, just a few years later, certainly after the book came out, and if it were later, I would have been writing about Hill Street. I would have been writing about St. Elsewhere. I would have been writing about those. Maybe they're the newer new shows. They were the ones that really grew on the base of what had been done in the earlier period.
Just a couple of these other shows that we wanted to name. Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In is one that you call out. Yeah,
Laugh-In was another way to show other kinds of things. Comedy. Obviously, the Smothers Brothers is in here too. The history, and B. and Cooley is great on this, David B. and Cooley. But the notion that one of the staples of television, the variety show, could become something like Laugh-In. And again, part of this is related to the 60s when there was a lot of social experimentation, to put it mildly, and people were aware of those things. And Have a Little Tea with Goldie was pretty obvious, and then I think plenty of, and then for those for whom it was not obvious, it was just fun. but there was that show was an amazing bit of experimentation, just in the way it was cut. Just in the way they put it together, I think was another great innovation there. So, but it ties in with those others as well. All part of this ferment that's going on in the industry at that time.
What about MASH?
MASH, of course, which for those of us who were, appalled, frightened about Vietnam, it was so clear what was going on, and it chokes me up. It really does. The episode that I write about, I choked up when I was writing about it. When Henry dies, it's that was a moment, I think, when you realize that a character who is so central and so fine and richly developed, that from the producer's, creator's, writer's point of view, you can kill him. That's a powerful moment in television, and there are all sorts of moments like that in MASH, when Radar's leaving and Hawkeye raises his bloody glove.
It's your passion. That's what makes it
Yeah,
great.
it is. It is.
One other one, An American Family.
Yeah, that was a pretty big experiment, and I think, was it An American Family or just American Family? I can't remember the title.
I think it's Anne.
Oh, you're talking about the
reality-
Louds.
yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
the reality piece. Yeah, I was thinking of the American Family, which was, with Seda, what was her name? That was a really powerful family show as well. The Loud thing was interesting for, I think, a small number of people. I mean, a lot of people might have watched it, but I'm not sure that it was as profound for a lot. I think a lot of people may have watched it out of a voyeuristic tendency. And in fact, I mean, it is voyeuristic, there's no question about it. But it was another experiment. It was another attempt to see what we can do here. Now, back shadow to all of this is the British stuff that's coming over on PBS, the early masterpiece things that I write about as well, which also were important because of their serialized nature. But there were documentaries, things like that, 7 Up, lots of stuff that people either saw in theaters or saw on television. And there was this sense that the BBC and Tim's were doing things that we were not doing, and that our industry was not doing. And so I think An American Family comes in at a time when people are trying to use the medium to go at the same kinds of social and cultural issues in a documentary fashion. The fact that it was serialized is probably the most important part of it in many ways. The coming out, all of that is crucial, divorces, this kind of thing. And I think it's pretty clear that certainly by the time the thing was done, the Louds were performing for the show. They knew what was going on and were good, as all reality shows do. No matter how true it begins or how raw it is at the beginning. The participants very quickly know how to perform and to perform their roles. But to follow it for that long, I think, was a key factor. And again, it reinforces the power of serialization. The rule of thumb, and by the time we get to the early 70s, is that you can't even break a movie into two parts. You can't show the bridge over the River Kwai on 2 nights, because the people who watch the first night are not going to come back. A great number of them are not going to come back. The people who try to start it in the middle are not going to know what's going on. What happened in the early 70s, of course, we had Dallas and we had Roots. And the power of the serialized Dallas story, I think, soap opera, prime time, demonstrated that you could do a continuing story. And then the success of Roots made it very clear that we could do miniseries like the British do, and we could come back to all that. So all of those shows in that period that I refer to and that others refer to as groundbreaking in some way are groundbreaking in many ways. They're groundbreaking for the industry, because it begins to open up ways that people can think about what they do in a different manner, and that they can convince New York from Los Angeles. They can convince New York that this is worth trying. They can convince the research departments. They can convince the advertisers, especially after the success of something like Dallas. Obviously, then they know they can convince the advertisers. But they also are convincing, they're also opening up to the viewers that television can tell stories in different ways, and that there can be explorations of ideas and problems and issues embedded in wonderful entertainment, that you don't sacrifice the one for the other, which we've known about literature for thousands of years. You know, if I were a producer with all the money in the world, you know, I would do the Iliad. You know, it's just such a story. And of course it's been done in different ways many times, but my God, what a story it is. And half of it is just guys sitting around on the beach talking and arguing and telling stories. But the stories they tell and the way you could do that, it's just, but we've known that. And we know it's a long book, you know, and you keep coming back for episode, and they're episode after episode, and they build and they grow until you have tragedy. And so now we know that we can do that with television. Why we didn't think of that in the early days, especially with soap opera going on at such successful rates during the day. And obviously a large part of it is, oh, that's for the women, you know, and this is for guys coming home at night. And that's all we need to know. And so give them some cop shows, give them some westerns, let the girls watch the TV during the day. And yet they are making time for it, they're coming back. And those shows, the soaps, are dealing with serious issues by this time. So it's a very interesting period. It was certainly an interesting period to be writing about it. It was interesting to do the column in the paper. I did that for 14 months. And it was really wonderful to know that I was writing something that lots of people would read, as opposed to the academic stuff I was writing. And that it made a difference for some people. You know, I would get letters about people who were angry about what I said. I would get letters saying how wonderful the column was, you know, what they had learned from it, and this kind of thing. So I think it was a period of ferment. The late 60s through the late 70s was a great period. And by the time I came here to Texas in 1978, was studying television in a slightly different way, but by this time, Hill Street hit, and that was another change. That was another moment.